heritage called the blood of the exploited working class. But they've overcome their shyness, now they're calling me your highness, and the world screams, kiss me, son of God. I destroyed the bond of friendship and respect between the only people left who'd even look me in the eye. Now I laugh and make a fortune off the same ones that I tortured, and the world screams, kiss me, son of God.
Mouthwashing isn't just a game, it's an unforgettable psychological horror experience. In a compact 3-hour runtime, it delivers betrayal, suspense, and despair so potent that it left me shaken, uneasy, and at times physically ill. But why play something so distressing? Because beneath its grim narrative lies an intricately woven story, where every character and choice adds new layers to its haunting tale. Today, we'll deep dive into the unsettling world of Mouthwashing, dissecting its chilling story and unforgettable characters. If you haven't played it yet, I highly recommend doing so spoiler free. It's available now on Steam just for $13. The game unfolds its narrative through a fragmented timeline, weaving events in a disorienting but effective manner. However, to fully explore the characters and expose the true depths of a certain individual's monstrosity, I will be recounting the story in chronological order. This approach allows us to better grasp the escalating tensions, the fractures within the crew, and the descent into chaos that defines Mouthwashing's harrowing tale. The opening of Mouthwashing introduces the Tulpar, a long-haul space freighter manufactured by the Pony Express, a company whose name evokes the historical American mail delivery service. The original Pony Express operated briefly between 1860 and 1861, covering nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. Riders endured hazardous terrain, physical exhaustion, and most importantly, isolation, often receiving poor pay and minimal protections for their efforts. The in-game Pony Express serves as a counterpart to its historical namesake, reflecting similar themes of worker exploitation but set in a futuristic corporate-driven context. Within the game, the company demonstrates a blatant disregard for its employees, including the 5-person crew aboard the Tulpar. For instance, workers are penalized for sleeping more than 5 hours, despite the standard human need for at least 7 hours of rest. Additionally, the company assigned a new intern to the crew, without accounting for the ship's limited resources, such as its 4 cryostasis pods, which are intended for emergency use and have a maximum operational capacity of 20 years. Furthermore, employees who voice concerns to human resources risk collective punishment, including significant pay deductions for the entire crew. The historical Pony Express and its futuristic counterpart share a common thread of neglect and exploitation of their workers. While the original Pony Express subjected riders to dangerous working conditions with little compensation or support, the game's version amplifies this exploitation in the corporate spacefaring context, offering a pointed critique of labor practices across eras. We also learned that the Tulpar shipment was originally planned to last 382 days, with 147 days already elapsed. However, what truly distinguishes this opening sequence is the ominous text displayed at the bottom of the screen. "I hope this hurts." This phrase serves as an arc word, a recurring thematic motif that carries profound narrative significance throughout the story. Arc words often encapsulate the emotional essence of a plot, as exemplified in Neon Genesis Evangelion, where impactful phrases flash on screen, framing pivotal moments. And additionally, to digress a bit, Mouthwashing appears to draw some inspirations from Evangelion, not only through its use of arc words, but also in its visual parallels. Captain Curly's post-crash appearance resembles the damaged Ava Unit 1, and the hallucination sequence strikingly resembles the end scene from the end of Evangelion. These arc words, including "take responsibility" and the reoccurring dialogue, "our worst moments don't make us monsters," establish the game's disquieting tone, offering insight into its characters' psyches. From the outset, I Hope This Hurts sets the stage for a harrowing narrative, immersing players in the sinister journey to come. In most stories involving a crash and survivors stranded in the aftermath, the characters' descent into chaos unfolds as they grapple with their new reality. However, in Mouthwash, Mouthwashing, the cracks begin to show long before the crash. One of the two playable characters is Jimmy, the co-pilot of the ship, whose perspective dominates much of the game. The second playable character is Captain Curly, and together, these two share what I believe is the game's strongest relationship, a bond that would typically be a source of strength, but in this case becomes their greatest downfall. To set the stage for the game of Mouthwashing, we'll be starting 7 days before the crash. 7 days before the crash, Captain Curly wrapped up his psychological evaluation with Anya. As the crew's nurse, it's Anya's job to keep tabs on everyone's mental health, a task that's especially important given the mission's year-long duration, and, of course, the isolation of space. These evaluations are supposed to be a big deal, but after Curly's session, it's clear he doesn't take them too seriously. Anya even mentions wishing he'd open up more, hinting that Curly might be struggling with something he's keeping to himself. At this point, Anya mentions she just has one more psychological evaluation left, Jimmy's. However, she admits she's not comfortable doing it alone. Jimmy has a reputation for not taking the process seriously, tossing out responses like claiming he's sexually attracted to cartoon horses. While that explains part of Anya's reluctance, there's an underlying tension between her and Jimmy that's hard to ignore. Curly steps in and offers to handle Jimmy's evaluation himself. He points out that he's known Jimmy the longest, and figures Jimmy will take him more seriously. As the captain and the crew's leader, he feels that it's his responsibility to intervene. This exchange gives us a glimpse into the complicated relationships among Anya, Curly, and Jimmy, insinuating a deeper story about the fractures within the crew. As Captain Curly heads off to evaluate Jimmy, we're introduced to Swansea, the ship's mechanic and all-around maintenance guy, as well as Daisuke, the new intern under Swansea's wing. Outside the utility room, Jimmy lets us know that Swansea and his intern have gotten themselves into a bit of trouble. Daisuke is portrayed as young, innocent, and a little naive, which becomes immediately clear when he tries to fix a broken vent. In doing so, he accidentally triggers the ship's emergency foam system. The foam is designed to seal breaches in the ship by rapidly expanding and hardening, creating an airtight seal to prevent air from escaping into space. While it's great for emergencies, it's less ideal when Daisuke ends up stuck in it. Meanwhile, Swansea berates Daisuke's accident with dialogue like, "Intern my ass," and "This kid was brought on board just to torture me," making it clear that Swansea does not like Daisuke. Well, at least not on the surface level at first. Their dynamic feels very real. A seasoned pro constantly frustrated with a rookie who can't seem to get things right at first. It's a relatable workplace trope that hits close to home for me. I've been in Daisuke's shoes as the new hire, shadowing a co-worker who had years of experience. Back when I worked in a kitchen, the head chef I trained under was relentless. I'd get called out for being too slow or not catching on fast enough. At the time, it was exhausting, but as time went on, I got better at my craft. Eventually the chef surprised me with a nice knife sharpener as a gift, telling me how much I'd grown. It's this kind of tough love mentorship that Daisuke and Swansea's relationship reminds me of. Curly steps in to help Daisuke escape his sticky situation, using an emergency fire axe to cut him free. As the captain, Curly is the only person who has access to tools like the axe and other supplies including sweetener, and more ominously at first, a firearm, which as you might guess, plays a role later on. We'll see more of Swansea and Daisuke's interactions as the story progresses. Jimmy informs Captain Curly that he will be waiting in the cockpit for a psychological evaluation. As Curly makes his way to meet him, the game shifts to a vivid, surreal dream sequence, offering a rare glimpse into Curly's internal struggles. This sequence is rich with symbolic imagery, which may also nod to the beach scene from the end of Evangelion. In the vision, Curly descends an endless staircase, eventually reaching a set of automatic doors. Beyond the doors lies a shallow expanse of red liquid. As Curly walks through it, crooked ladders emerge from the water, stretching upward in chaotic directions. Emergency warnings flash in the sky, culminating in the sudden appearance of a massive sun. The dream ends as Curly approaches the sun, leaving players to interpret its significance. This sequence serves as a striking metaphor for Curly's mental state. The ladders, a recurring visual motif, may symbolize ambition or progress, yet their disordered arrangement and abrupt terminations evoke a sense of confusion and stagnation, hinting at a struggle with direction or purpose. This aligns with Curly's later admission of an existential crisis, where he questions his role and value as captain of the Tulpar. The oppressive corporate environment of the Pony Express also adds to this interpretation. Throughout the game, the company's presence is reinforced by cheerful yet foreboding slogans like Pole says lend a hand, teamwork is the soul of success, paired with warnings such as HR complaints about poor team synergy may result in collective punishment. These messages serve as a constant reminders of the crew's subservience to corporate interests, likely compounding Curly's feelings of entrapment and self-doubt. After the sequence ends, Curly arrives at the cockpit to conduct Jimmy's evaluation, which begins with Jimmy expressing disregard about the process. He remarks that these evaluations seem useless since the company never acts on them. Curly acknowledges the sentiment, but encourages Jimmy to persevere. The game then transitions to the conclusion of the evaluation, where Curly takes a more personal approach, asking Jimmy to share his honest thoughts off the record. Jimmy's response is unsettling in light of future events. He admits that he enjoys life aboard the Tulpar because the mission gives him a sense of control, and if you know what Jimmy does to Anya, that makes the whole entire statement even more unsettling. Curly uses the moment to commend Jimmy for his performance as co-pilot, especially considering the struggles Jimmy experienced on Earth, details that remain understated throughout the game. Jimmy, however, responds in a way that reveals subtle tension. He comments on how frequently others praise Curly's leadership, admitting that while he agrees, the constant admiration can be frustrating. His words suggest a bit of envy. Despite his respect for Curly, Jimmy also thinks that his captain is burdened by something deeper and questions about it. Curly confides in Jimmy rather than Anya and reveals the strength of their friendship. Curly admits to facing an existential crisis. While he takes pride in his accomplishments as a long-haul freighter captain, he questions whether this is all he will ever achieve. He feels torn between remaining in a role where he has excelled in, or risking failure by pursuing something new. Jimmy empathizes and makes an insightful analogy that ties back to the earlier nightmare sequence featuring the ladders. He compares Curly's position to having reached the top of a very tall ladder, noting that even if the view feels uncertain, the climb itself was a significant accomplishment. Jimmy, who is still climbing his own ladder, admires Curly's achievements, while simultaneously feeling the weight of his own slow progress. He openly acknowledges that he enjoys the sense of control he has aboard the Tulpar, a sentiment that underscores his envy of Curly's authority over the crew. Their discussion draws a clear contrast between Curly's introspective uncertainty and Jimmy's career frustrations. Curly, realizing that his own venting might diminish Jimmy's struggles, reassures his co-pilot by expressing confidence in his abilities. The conversation concludes on this positive note, interrupted by the arrival of a message from the Pony Express. Jimmy exits, leaving Curly to read the communication in private, delivered via a fax machine. In a world with chirostasis pods and spaceships, it's a funny little detail that really drives home how cheap the company is. The letter itself is pretty vague, but gives off an ominous vibe, hinting that the Pony Express has a tighter grip on the Tulpar and its crew than anyone might like. Once the story returns to the moment Curly reads the letter, the game presents a new objective: break the news. The message is clear. The Pony Express company is shutting down for unknown reasons. This revelation is awkwardly timed, as Curly enters the lounge to find the crew throwing a communal surprise birthday party for him, an event they celebrate just once a year. The festive atmosphere sharply contrasts with the weight of the message he carries. The Pony Express allows for one birthday party per year per trip. This rule further shows just how oppressive the company is, with the last trip's birthday party being Swansea's. This scene offers interesting visual cues about the crew's relationships. During the party, Anya and Jimmy are positioned at opposite corners of the room, with Daisuke and Swansea positioned between them. This separation subtly highlights the tension hinted at earlier in the story, particularly Anya's discomfort with Jimmy. Even after the initial cutscene ends and the crew disperses, waiting for Curly to finish preparing the cake, he's the only one authorized to access the precious sweetener packet. The sense of distance remains. Anya and Jimmy are still at opposite ends of the room, though this time Swansea alone separates them. When the crew finally gathers to eat the cake, Anya sits at one end of the table, and Jimmy on the side, keeping the subtle visual metaphor for their strained relationship intact. This choice reinforces earlier clues about Anya's reluctance to conduct Jimmy's evaluation, not only because of his lack of seriousness, but also possibly due to deeper discomfort. The communal birthday with its cheerful facade contrasts with the underlying tension in the grim news Curly must deliver. This combination of celebratory and strained dynamics creates a poignant moment that emphasizes the fragility of the crew's relationship aboard the Tulpar. As the crew gathers around the table, they urge Curly to give a speech. However, the looming reality of the Pony Express shutting down weighs heavily on his mind, overshadowing the festive atmosphere. Jimmy is the first to notice something is wrong, pressing Curly to reveal the truth. Unable to keep the secret, Curly shares the devastating news earlier than instructed by the company, a decision that sets off a chain of events, ultimately leading to the crash of the Tulpar. The crew's reaction to the announcement vary widely. Swansea is unsurprised, remarking that the writing's been on the wall for a long time. Anya, on the other hand, is visibly distraught, lamenting the loss of her income and the financial ruin it would bring due to her lack of savings. Daisuke remains silent. A wealthy family's influence forced him into an internship aboard the Tulpar, and he has struggled to find his own direction in life. The most intense reaction comes from Jimmy, who lashes out at Curly with anger and bitterness. Referencing Curly's earlier confession about his existential crisis, Jimmy accuses him of using the company's closure as an easy escape from his responsibilities as captain. This tirade highlights Jimmy's underlying envy and resentment. To Jimmy, Curly represents everything he aspires to be, a respected, capable leader with a stable future. Yet Jimmy interprets Curly's prior comments as dismissive of the struggles he himself faces. His anger builds as he accuses Curly of treating the job, the ship, and the crew as burdens he can now abandon guilt-free. Jimmy's accusation hits a nerve when he claims Curly is seeking a way to preserve his image as the model captain, even as he leaves the crew behind. At this, Jimmy slams his hand on the table, declaring, "Abandon the crew, but remain the model captain." Curly is left silent, either unwilling to escalate the confrontation or burdened by the weight of his own self-doubt and guilt. The scene poignantly underscores the inner conflict Curly faces. Even if the Pony Express had remained operational, Curly would likely have struggled with the decision to resign. The tight-knit nature of the crew, forged through countless missions in the confined space of the Tulpar, resembles a surrogate family. Walking away from such bonds would be deeply painful, and Curly's hesitation reflects the emotional toll of balancing personal growth with loyalty to those who depend on him. Jimmy's outburst externalizes Curly's own guilt and self-recrimination, exposing the emotional complexity of his dilemma. Does he have the right to pursue his ambitions, even at the cost of those who look up to him? Or is his role as captain a duty he must shoulder, regardless of his personal desires? Ultimately, Curly's situation presents an agonizing dilemma, the tension between his personal ambition to grow and his loyalty to his crew. Jimmy's accusation serves as a painful echo of Curly's own guilty conscience, vocalizing thoughts that had only been internal until now. As Curly listens, he is forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of his conflicting desires, his longing for personal freedom and growth versus his responsibility to those who depend on him. On a quick note, this moment not only deepens the emotional stakes, but also lays bare the nuanced dynamics between Curly and his crew. It's a raw, humanizing exploration of leadership, where even the strongest figures wrestle with self-doubt and the weight of their decisions. Before we move on to the next segment, please be aware that it will include discussion of sexual assault, trauma, and other sensitive topics. If this is something you prefer to avoid, now is a good time to step away. This will be my final warning before diving deeper into the story of Mouthwashing. The next chronological event takes place 2 days before the crash, revealing an unsettling conversation between Anya and Curly. This scene sheds light on Anya's discomfort with Jimmy, and offers significant insight into how Curly perceives the events that transpired between them. The interaction occurs during the crew's sleep time, with the ship's lounge screen displaying a serene night sky to simulate a peaceful atmosphere. Both Anya and Curly find themselves awake due to insomnia. Anya begins by mentioning her fondness for the night display and points out a dead pixel in the upper right corner. She explains that while the flaw is small, It's something she can't unsee. It's always in the back of her mind. Curly, however, chooses to stop searching for the pixel, preferring to leave it unnoticed, as acknowledging it would ruin the illusion of perfection. This dialogue is deeply symbolic, reflecting their differing coping mechanisms. Anya carries the weight of her trauma, while Curly avoids confronting uncomfortable truths to preserve the illusion of peace. Anya then asks Curly how much longer the journey will last. Curly responds with 237 days, prompting Anya to calculate it as roughly 8 months. Curly remains silent after this comment, a response that subtly conveys his awareness of what happened between Anya and Jimmy. By piecing together the timeline, it becomes evident that the assault likely occurred before the plot begins, as the crew has been traveling for 145 days, nearly 5 months. This would align with the time frame for Anya to have recognized the underlying implications of her trauma. Curly's silence, much like during Jimmy's earlier confrontation, suggests guilt and shame over his failure to act on Jimmy's vile action. The dead pixel analogy takes on even greater meaning in this context. For Anya, the dead pixel represents her trauma, an unchangeable, ever-present nightmare. For Curly, it symbolizes his denial. He would rather ignore the flaw to maintain a sense of normalcy. In the broader context, this reflects Curly's reluctance to take responsibility for the dynamics aboard the Tulpar. Curly knows that addressing what happened could have severe consequences for the crew. Reporting such an incident to the Pony Express's HR would likely result in pay cuts for everyone and reflect poorly on his leadership. This pressure to preserve the crew's livelihood traps Curly in inaction. Anya then questions why the medical room has a lock, while the sleeping quarters do not. Curly's response that it's for the same reason the cockpit has a lock, safety, is loaded with tragic irony. The lack of locks to the sleeping quarters left Anya vulnerable, allowing for Jimmy's assault. The company's failure to prioritize genuine safety underscores systemic neglect, while Curly's acceptance of these flaws reflect his internal struggle with his responsibilities. The phrase, "take responsibility," which flashes throughout the game, reinforces this overarching theme. Both Curly and Jimmy fail to fully acknowledge or address the consequences of their actions. Curly's passive acceptance of Jimmy's behavior ultimately contributes to the tragedies that unfold, including the eventual crash of the Tulpar. In a final chilling parallel, Curly's suffering during the crash mirrors Anya's earlier trauma, as the ship loses control due to Jimmy's sabotage. Curly enters the cockpit in a desperate attempt to correct the course. His efforts fail, leaving him severely burned and dismembered. Both Anya's assault and Curly's injuries occur in spaces referenced during the dead pixel conversation, the sleeping quarters and the cockpit, further tying Curly's inaction to the devastating outcomes for himself and the crew. This event highlights the pervasive impact of denial, guilt, and systemic negligence, all of which intertwine to drive the Tulpar and its crew toward disaster. The narrative moves to one day before the crash. Jimmy's unpredictable actions now pose a clear threat, not only to Anya, but potentially to the entire crew. Curly begins searching for a hidden gun case, which Anya has concealed out of fear of what Jimmy might do, given the grim revelations about his behavior. Curly finds Anya in the cockpit, where she reveals she is pregnant. Curly, dumbfounded, asks who, to which Anya responds bluntly, Jimmy. Her reaction highlights her frustration and exhaustion, while Curly's shock underscores his lingering ignorance about the full scope of the situation. Attempting to console Anya and perhaps himself, Curly promises to fix this. However, his reassurance falls flat, as he adds that her hiding the gun won't be included in the performance log, emphasizing his ongoing prioritization of possibly preserving his own reputation as captain. Anya then explains her reasoning for hiding the gun, not to harm herself, but to ensure Jimmy couldn't access it. She feared what he might do to preserve his reputation, knowing his actions would lead to severe consequences, including arrest. Her foresight proves tragically prescient as the story moves to the day of the crash. Anya is shown in the medical room, kneeling and crying. She has just informed Jimmy of her pregnancy, and he walked out without a word. Something disturbing must have occurred during their exchange, as Anya later expresses that she no longer wants Jimmy on board. This suggests that Jimmy may have issued a threat or a cruel remark that left her deeply unsettled. Recognizing that the situation is spiraling out of control, Curly rushes to find Jimmy before things escalate further. When Curly finds Jimmy just outside the cockpit, he pleads with him to let him fix things, saying it's just another challenge they need to overcome. However, Jimmy has already made up his mind. He tells Curly that once the ship lands and the truth comes out about what he's done, his life will be over. Particularly the phrase, "take responsibility," suggesting that as captain, Curly will also face judgment for failing to protect his crew. Jimmy's manipulation echoes his behavior during the communal birthday party, where he exploited Curly's self-doubt and guilt. Now Jimmy escalates his strategy, planting the idea that their situation is irreparable. Jimmy proposes a sinister solution: crash the ship and ensure that no one ever discovers what happened on the toolbar. This act, he argues, would preserve their reputations in death, leaving the crash as a tragic mystery rather than a scandalous revelation. As Jimmy speaks, the flash screens appear more frequently, particularly the phrase, "take responsibility." This repetition underscores the overarching theme of neglecting accountability, both in Jimmy's manipulative justification and Curly's internal struggle with his failures as captain. Though Curly doesn't explicitly agree with Jimmy's plan, his silence speaks volumes. This moment of inaction symbolizes his internal admission of guilt, his acknowledgement of Jimmy's influence, and his near breaking point under the weight of existential dread, personal betrayals, and the collapse of his company. As Jimmy places a hand on Curly's shoulder and says, "I'll take care of it," Curly watches in resigned disbelief as Jimmy walks into the cockpit. Once alone, Jimmy disengages the autopilot, sending the toolbar off course toward a massive asteroid. Alarms blare, and Curly rushes to the cockpit, only to find Jimmy sitting outside, his head in his hands. Seeing the disastrous trajectory of the ship, Curly is overcome with guilt, realizing he should have intervened sooner. Despite his best efforts to correct the course, it's too late. The toolbar crashes with Curly stationed in the cockpit, the first point of impact, suffering catastrophic injuries. This devastating conclusion ties together the thematic threads of Mouthwashing, where neglect, manipulation, and the failure to take responsibility culminate in tragedy. The narrative now shifts to 2 months post-crash, revealing the grim aftermath for the surviving crew members aboard the toolbar. Captain Curly, once a pillar of leadership, has been left physically and emotionally shattered. Severely burned in the crash, he has lost his limbs and vocal cords, leaving him bedridden and incapable of communicating beyond anguished cries. His helpless state forces Anya and Jimmy to administer his painkillers, specifically oxycodone, a drug as numbing as it is addictive. Despite her best efforts, Anya could do little to alleviate Curly's suffering aside from dulling his pain, but the task soon becomes too much for her to bear. Curly's current state starkly reflects the consequences of his earlier inaction regarding Jimmy. While one might argue that Curly ignored the danger Jimmy posed, which he did, basically enabling Jimmy to commit his later action of crashing the toolbar, his punishment seems disproportionately cruel. The reality of the situation is complicated. Curly lacked viable options to deal with Jimmy. Killing him would have left the ship without a co-pilot, and detaining him could have provoked sabotage from a man who clearly had nothing else to lose. Even locking Jimmy in cryostasis posed risks, as the limited pods meant another crew member would be left vulnerable in case of emergencies. These what-ifs no longer matter, however, as the crew is left to grapple with the brutal consequences of past decisions. In the current timeline, Anya's initial attempts to care for Curly involve feeding him painkillers, but the experience is deeply unsettling, reminding her of her own trauma. Curly's pain is so severe that he writhes and cries out whenever given his medicine, leaving Anya visibly disturbed. Unable to continue, she asks Jimmy to take over. At first, Jimmy resists, questioning her medical competence and berating her, before reluctantly accepting. When Jimmy administers the pills, the scene fades to black, with only the harrowing sound of Curly's cries and moans of agony to convey his suffering. Anya, overwhelmed, flees the room nauseous and distraught. What remains unseen is Jimmy's growing frustration with Curly's resistance. His annoyance soon escalates into outright abuse as he physically forces the medication onto Curly. This power dynamic between a defenseless Curly and an increasingly unhinged Jimmy mirrors the trauma Anya experienced at Jimmy's hands. Watching Jimmy mistreat Curly likely serves as a visceral trigger for Anya, reminding her of her own vulnerability and helplessness during her assault. Additionally, Additionally, as Anya nears the birth of her child, her physical and emotional fragility amplifies her nausea and distress. Jimmy's manipulation doesn't end with his treatment of Curly. Following the crash, he fabricates a narrative that shifts blame onto Curly, exploiting the fact that Curly was the last person in the cockpit. Jimmy claims that the captain, overwhelmed by stress from the failing Pony Express and his own struggles, attempted a murder-suicide. The surviving crew initially accepts this explanation, either out of naivety or convenience. Swansea continues his grumpy routine, often berating Daisuke, who tries to remain optimistic, despite being dismissed by Jimmy as a nuisance. Meanwhile, Anya finds herself trapped in close quarters with her abuser, forced to tread carefully around him. Anya's behavior toward Jimmy is marked by extreme caution and strategic appeasement. She is overly apologetic and showers him with praise, telling him he's capable, not because she believes it, but to avoid provoking his volatile temper. Her caution speaks to her survival instinct in the face of an emotionally unstable abuser. The sight of Jimmy force-feeding Curly his medication becomes another layer of torment for Anya. It reflects both her unresolved trauma and the inescapable power Jimmy holds over the crew. Watching Jimmy brutalize a helpless Curly may evoke memories of her own defenselessness during the assault, compounding her psychological distress. The parallels between Curly's suffering and her own experiences intensify Anya's feeling of powerlessness, leaving her isolated and navigating a moral and emotional minefield aboard the Tulpar. The crew's discovery of the mouthwash is a striking moment of absurdity and irony, highlighting their desperate circumstances and the overbearing influence of the Pony Express. Months into the crash, rations and medicine are running dangerously low. Yet despite their dire state, the crew hesitates to open the mysterious cargo, paralyzed by fear of corporate repercussions. Their hesitation reveals the pervasive grip of the Pony Express, symbolized by omnipresent propaganda featuring their mascot, Pole, which reinforces a lingering authority even in the void of space. The mouthwash itself serves as a strange representation for the story's themes, particularly failure, manipulation, and the futility of superficial solutions. Anya, the first to assess the mouthwash, notes the irony in its uselessness. The high sugar content renders its disinfectant properties ineffective. Swansea, battling personal demons, sees the ethanol content, 14%, akin to alcoholic beverages, and uses it as a justification to break 15 years of sobriety. Meanwhile, Daisuke's naive optimism emerges when he jokes that at least they'll smell good. Each crew member's reaction to the discovery reflects their internal struggles and coping mechanisms, but Jimmy's silence stands out. Focused on maintaining his facade as a hero, Jimmy views the mouthwash's revelation as yet another failure, as it offers no meaningful benefit to their predicament. The mouthwash's label, kills 99.9%, ties neatly into the game's overarching themes. The phrase could foreshadow the near total decimation of the crew, leaving only one survivor, or it could represent Jimmy's catastrophic solution of crashing the ship. Jimmy's plan was meant to erase every trace of his crimes aboard the Tulpar, eliminating all evidence and silencing witnesses. However, through Curly's desperate attempt to regain control of the ship, that slim 0.1% chance of survival becomes reality, albeit at a devastating cost. The mouthwash's composition offers further layers of irony and thematic resonance. Sugar added for flavor makes the product appealing, but negates its intended purpose as disinfectant. This mirrors Curly's role as captain. His sweetness and care for his crew made him beloved, but these same qualities blinded him to the dangers posed by Jimmy. Curly's failure to act decisively allowed Jimmy's toxic behavior to escalate, culminating in the ship's crash. Meanwhile, the ethanol in the mouthwash, often associated with cleansing, aligns with Curly's captaincy responsibilities, which he ultimately could not fulfill effectively. One fascinating piece of analysis suggests a visual connection between Curly's post-crash appearance and the mouthwash bottle. After the crash, Curly is clad in pale blue medical gown, resembling the color of the liquid, with his head wrapped in white bandages, like the bottle's cap. This visual metaphor deepens when considering his character arc. Pre-crash, Curly was respected and cherished, much like the mouthwash's pleasant flavoring. Yet his sweetness, his willingness to protect Jimmy, even at the expense of Anya and the crew, negated his ability to act as an effective leader. The bacteria in this analogy is Jimmy, whose manipulations and violence fed off Curly's vulnerabilities. Curly's duality, both as sugar and ethanol, captures his tragic complexity. He cared deeply for his crew and tried to maintain harmony, but his failure to confront Jimmy's actions led to disastrous consequences. Jimmy the bacteria exploited Curly's kindness and his hesitance to take decisive action, ultimately consuming the crew from within. The absurdity of the mouthwash discovery is emblematic of the Tulpar's journey as a whole. Its label and promises, like the propaganda of the Pony Express, represent superficial solutions to deeper systemic problems. It's a product designed to cleanse, but it ultimately causes harm, paralleling Curly's well-meaning leadership that unintentionally paved the way for catastrophe. Similarly, the mouthwash's appeal, its sugary taste, renders it counterproductive, much like the surface-level closeness Curly tried to foster among a fractured crew, or more importantly, Jimmy. In essence, the mouthwash is more than just a comedic or ironic plot point. It's a distilled symbol of futility, failures, and moral ambiguities that define the story of mouthwashing. 3 months after the crash, Jimmy is consumed by his self-imposed role as a crew's leader. His focus on Curly's treatment feels like an attempt to mirror Curly's respected leadership, but this effort is both hollow and ironic, given Jimmy's culpability and their current plight. The question of why the crew doesn't mercy kill Curly lingers uncomfortably in the narrative. Perhaps they cling to hope of a rescue, or perhaps Jimmy insists on keeping Curly alive to maintain the illusion of his own heroism, embodying the role of a captain who takes responsibility for his crew. The bitter irony, of course, is that none of them would be in this predicament if Jimmy hadn't sabotaged the ship. When Jimmy discovers that Anya hasn't given Curly his painkillers, he confronts her in the cockpit, an unusual meeting point, suggesting that she and Swansea might have been privately discussing something they didn't want Jimmy to hear. Jimmy, frustrated and determined to keep up appearances, heads to the medical room to administer the medicine himself. What follows is a grim reflection of his fractured psyche. Alone with the incapacitated Curly, Jimmy begins venting his frustrations, blaming Curly for the burdens of leadership. His anger peaks as he spits out the sarcastic and venomous line, "I hope these make you feel fucking better." This violent display, coupled with his physical treatment of Curly, underscores how deeply Jimmy is projecting his own guilt and failures onto the former captain. Jimmy's behavior reveals his inability to confront the truth. He resents the position he's in, but instead of accepting responsibility, he casts Curly as a scapegoat. This denial will ultimately come to a head in the judgment section of the story, where Jimmy faces the consequences of his actions. Even then, his tendency to dodge accountability and blame others will underscore his characterization as a man-child, perpetually running from the weight of his choices. Curly, trapped in a state of helpless suffering, becomes both a victim of Jimmy's violence and a symbol of the responsibility Jimmy refuses to shoulder. Each interaction between them adds layers of tension and irony, showcasing the devastating effects of Jimmy's inability to accept the truth. The only person responsible for their misery is himself. Another month passes, bringing us to the 4th month post-crash, and tensions aboard the Tulpar escalate dramatically. Jimmy faces a heated confrontation with the drunken Swansea after Anya informs him of additional medical supplies trapped beneath the emergency foam from the crash. The only way to access them is with emergency fire axe, which Swansea drunkenly dances with, mocking Jimmy in the process. When Jimmy tries to reason with him, Swansea reluctantly surrenders the axe, but not without ridiculing Jimmy's attempt at leadership. His scathing comments reinforce the crew's sentiment that Jimmy is a pale shadow of Captain Curly, a comparison that deepens Jimmy's insecurities and frustrations. After retrieving the medicine, Anya asks Jimmy to administer it to Curly, explaining that doing so makes her nauseous. This simple request pushes Jimmy over the edge, and he lashes out at Anya with verbal abuse. Anya, who has been constantly praising Jimmy in an effort to appease him and avoid his anger, sees her worst fears realized. Her so-called praise is revealed as a self-defense mechanism, but even this cannot prevent Jimmy's explosive reaction. Earlier, Jimmy had confessed that he had felt that the crew was silently judging him, either for his failures as a captain or for his possible role in the Tulpar's crash. His outburst course, that Anya reveals the depth of his guilt and the pressure he feels, but it also highlights his hypocrisy. Jimmy complains about the overwhelming responsibility of his role, conveniently forgetting that he put himself in this position, while actively avoiding accountability for his actions, particularly his assault on Anya. Notably, Jimmy's guilt remains entirely self-centered. He feels no remorse for what he did to Anya, focusing instead on how her pregnancy might affect him. His concern centers on the punishment he might face if the crew is ever rescued, and he views impending fatherhood as a burden rather than a consequence of his actions. At this point, Jimmy fully dehumanizes Anya, reducing her to yet another problem to be managed, much like how he treats Daisuke, who he soon manipulates. By this point, Jimmy's selfishness has become glaringly evident. He prioritizes his own interests above all else, manipulating the crew to maintain control and preserve the illusion of leadership, while Swansea remains openly resentful of Jimmy. The rest of the crew appears subdued, either out of fear or necessity. Jimmy's actions reveal him as a deeply flawed and destructive force, steering the crew further into chaos and despair. The 5th month aboard the Tulpar marks a turning point, as events spiral into even darker territory. Daisuke frantically informs Jimmy that Anya has locked herself inside the medical room, initially claiming it to be a freak accident. When Jimmy arrives, the truth emerges. Anya intentionally sealed herself inside, determined to take her own life. Through the door, Anya explains that this decision is not a mistake, but the best choice she can make. Most hauntingly, she echoes Jimmy's cruel words from the day of the crash. She admits that he was right, and that she should have done this from the beginning. She concludes with, "I'll take care of it," a line repeated throughout the game by both Jimmy and Curly, adding a chilling resonance to her statement. This moment draws a direct line to the day of the crash, when Anya told Jimmy she was pregnant. Based on Anya's dialogue and her plea for Jimmy to be removed from the Tulpar, it becomes evident that Jimmy had urged her to unalive herself, selfishly trying to avoid the responsibilities of fatherhood and accountability for his assault. Anya's words reflect the emotional manipulation she endured, as she internalizes the blame for the Tulpar's crash, wrongly believing that her death could have prevented the disaster. This reveals the extent of Jimmy's cruelty, showing him as the true monster aboard the ship. To reach the medical room, Daisuke suggests entering through a vent in the utility room, which Swansea is guarding while heavily intoxicated on mouthwash. Jimmy, demonstrating his cunning and a lack of empathy, concocts a dangerous cocktail of mouthwash, sweetener, and isopropyl alcohol, the last bottle of disinfectant on board, to incapacitate Swansea. Jimmy's quick improvisation of this deadly drink hints at a sinister side, potentially tying back to his history of assault and manipulation. Daisuke, in contrast, shows genuine concern for Swansea's well-being, while Jimmy remains indifferent, focused solely on achieving his goal. Inside the utility room, the pair discover a hidden Chirostasis pod, a secret Swansea had kept. While Daisuke is shocked, Jimmy seizes the moment to vilify Swansea, framing him as a villain to reinforce his own perceived heroism. This manipulation further illustrates Jimmy's selfishness, as he exploits Daisuke's naivety to maintain control. The vent connecting the utility room to the medical room poses a significant hazard, with exposed wires sparking dangerously. Daisuke, understandably hesitant, suggests waiting for Swansea to recover and desist. However, Jimmy manipulates Daisuke into attempting the risky maneuver, convincing him that success would earn Swansea's admiration. This moment highlights Jimmy's calculated exploitation of Daisuke, painting the task as a noble act to save Anya and Curly. In truth, Jimmy has dehumanized Anya entirely, viewing her as just another problem, and his motivation is to keep the crew alive for his own self-serving narrative of heroism. As Daisuke reluctantly enters the vent, the screen fades to black. The agonizing screams that follow confirm his horrific injuries from the exposed wires. This moment encapsulates Jimmy's complete moral descent, his relentless pursuit of control, his manipulation of others, and his utter disregard for the lives and well-being of those around him. In his attempt to preserve his fragile sense of authority, Jimmy ensures the crew's continued suffering, cementing his place as the story's central antagonist. Despite Daisuke's injuries, he manages to unlock the doors to the medical room, revealing Anya's tragic fate. She has taken her own life by overdosing on medication. All the while, Curly remains immobilized, a helpless observer to the devastation unfolding around him. For Curly, This moment marks the culmination of his failure to confront Jimmy's behavior. Ignoring Jimmy's escalating actions has led directly to Anya's death. However, while Curly bears partial responsibility for neglecting his duties as captain, the ultimate blame lies squarely with Jimmy, whose manipulation and selfishness drove Anya to her breaking point. Meanwhile, Daisuke lies bleeding and writhing in pain from his injuries in the vent. Swansea, upon realizing the severity of Daisuke's condition, demands disinfectant to treat him, only to learn that Jimmy used the last bottle to create the cocktail that incapacitated Swansea earlier. Furious, Swansea openly calls Jimmy useless, a scathing reflection of his disdain for Jimmy's incompetence and responsibility for Daisuke's injuries. During their argument, Jimmy attempts to deflect blame onto Swansea for refusing to open the utility room door earlier. While Swansea's stubbornness may have contributed to the situation, the ultimate danger of the vent meant that harm was likely inevitable, regardless of who facilitated the access. As Jimmy searches near the cargo bay for any remaining medicine, he experiences a haunting delusion, much like Curly's nightmare sequence. However, Jimmy's vision represents the rapid deterioration of his mental state and his newfound guilt over Daisuke's near-fatal injuries. In this delusion, we see a gravestone with a pink hibiscus flower placed before it, this flower matching the one on Daisuke's shirt. In many traditions, hibiscus flowers symbolize positivity, unity, and remembrance of the departed, aligning with Daisuke's persistent optimism, which has now been crushed. The flower becomes a symbol of Daisuke's suffering and Jimmy's culpability for the harm inflicted on his crew. As the delusion intensifies, Jimmy is pursued by a monstrous version of Pole, the Pony Express's mascot, now grotesque and towering in size. The creature embodies Jimmy's guilt and mounting responsibilities, forcing him to confront the weight of his actions. Before the chase begins, Jimmy reads a chilling note: "You can't run from it." This stark message reflects the central conflict of Jimmy's arc, his desperate attempt to avoid responsibility, which now manifests as an inescapable nightmare. With the consequences of his selfishness laid bare, Jimmy's delusion serves as a harrowing reminder of the destruction he has caused and the guilt he can no longer ignore. This sequence further unravels the chaos aboard the Tulpar, as Jimmy's delusions and Swansea's grim acceptance of reality collide in a devastating moment. Returning to the injured and dying Daisuke, Jimmy clings to the delusion that he can somehow fix the situation. His repeated self-reassurance starkly contrasts with his actual failures as a leader, especially when compared to the respected and capable Captain Curly. Meanwhile, Swansea, fully aware of the hopelessness of the situation, prepares to end Daisuke's suffering. Before delivering the mercy blow with the fire axe, Swansea reflects on Daisuke's unwavering optimism and laments the potential he saw in the young intern. In a somber moment, Swansea acknowledges that Daisuke was just a good kid, trying his best before swinging the axe, ending Daisuke's life. Jimmy, now spiraling further into denial, continues to insist that he could have saved Daisuke. However, with nearly all resources depleted, Swansea calls out Jimmy's delusion, bluntly holding him responsible for Daisuke's fate. Jimmy, unable to accept this truth, deflects by accusing Swansea of selfishly keeping the hidden Chirostasis pod for himself, and manipulating Anya during their private conversation in the cockpit. Swansea, unfazed, mocks Jimmy's accusation, hinting that Anya had confided in him about Jimmy's actions, his assault. Jimmy's silence in response is telling, as it signals his awareness of his guilt and the futility of his attempts to shift blame. Jimmy's paranoia peaks as he becomes convinced Swansea is a threat, believing he must protect himself. Fueled by his deteriorating mental state in previous delusions, Jimmy makes his way to retrieve the hidden firearm beneath Curly's bed. This act of desperation reflects Jimmy's increasingly warped perspective. Where Swansea sees an inevitable end, Jimmy believes that eliminating Swansea is the key to fixing everything. However, Jimmy's decision to grab the gun proves Anya's earlier fears correct. Her choice to hide the weapon stemmed from her belief that Jimmy would eventually use it, irrationally, a prediction now fully realized. The irony of the situation is underscored when Curly, unable to speak, begins laughing as Jimmy opens the gun case. The gun, ostensibly intended for emergencies such as mutiny or violent outburst, is now in the hands of the very person responsible for the Tulpar's destruction. Curly's laughter feels both tragic and sardonic, a reflection of his own mental decline, but also an acknowledgement that using the gun on Jimmy earlier would have been the right choice. Jimmy's declaration as the new captain post-crash, combined with his irrational and destructive actions, reveals that he has indeed become the very mutineer the gun was meant to stop. This moment encapsulates the ultimate tragedy of the Tulpar, a shipwreck not only of metal, but of morality and humanity. With two crewmates dead, Curly incapacitated, and Swansea barely holding on to sanity, well, at least in Jimmy's perspective. Jimmy's delusional belief that he can still fix everything serves only to deepen the fractures among the remaining crew. His refusal to accept responsibility, paired with his descent into violence and paranoia, ensures that the Tulpar's doomed trajectory extends far beyond the crash itself. Before Jimmy and Swansea's final confrontation, Jimmy experiences another delusion, traversing enormous vents littered with symbolic reminders of his guilt. Daisuke's personal belongings, dumbbells, a handheld gaming device, and the recurring pink hibiscus flowers surround him, each a haunting echo of the life lost due to his manipulation. The vent serves as a physical and mental gauntlet, forcing Jimmy to confront his torment. Throughout, he's repeatedly shown notes marked with responsibility, driving home the weight of his failures. The delusion culminates in a surreal showdown in a cemetery, where Swansea, armed with an axe, charges at Jimmy. The player must shoot Swansea several times to progress. Amid the gravestones and a shrine to Daisuke, a photo of his employee card beside a hibiscus flower. The setting underscores that Jimmy and Swansea are literally and figuratively surrounded by the dead, all victims of Jimmy's actions. When the delusion ends, the scene shifts to Swansea tied to a chair, their actual confrontation now revealed as a byproduct of Jimmy's unraveling mind. However, Swansea's hands are untied during his final monologue, symbolizing his acceptance of the situation and his freedom from the metaphorical bindings of guilt and denial. This contrasts sharply with Jimmy, who remains trapped in delusions of control and redemption. Swansea's speech offers a poignant reflection on his life, including his battle with alcoholism, and a turning point where he envisioned himself as a bloated corpse in a ditch. That vision drove him to change, achieving what society deems successful, a loving family, sobriety, and a respectable career. Yet despite these accomplishments, Swansea admits he never felt truly happy. Ironically, his days of alcoholism, when his responsibilities were fewer, brought him fleeting joy. This mirrors Curly's earlier existential crisis. Despite being at the peak of his career as captain, Curly longed for something more outside the constraints of the Pony Express. Similarly, Swansea acknowledges that responsibility, while burdensome, is the mark of a good man, even if it doesn't bring happiness. Swansea contrasts this acceptance with Jimmy's refusal to take accountability, calling him a selfish coward who runs from judgment. Unlike Swansea, who confronts his mistakes head-on, or as he says it, to face the music, Jimmy manipulates others to shoulder the consequences of his failures. Swansea's final words are filled with acceptance. However, he does express regret over one thing. He admits he should have protected Daisuke, whom he initially viewed as a nuisance but later came to value. It's implied that Swansea, a father to daughters on Earth, may have been saving the Chirostasis pod for Daisuke, feeling a paternal instinct toward the optimistic young intern. Swansea mourns Daisuke's lost potential, imagining a future where the boy might have grown into a grumpy old man like himself. However, Swansea also recognizes that Daisuke's optimism was a unique and irreplaceable quality, something he could have learned from had circumstances been different. In a tragic culmination, Swansea fully accepts who he is, flaws and all, and faces his death with dignity. Meanwhile, Jimmy, clinging to the delusion that he can fix everything, takes Swansea's life. Swansea's parting insult cuts deep, exposing Jimmy's futility and selfishness, but it doesn't stop Jimmy from pulling the trigger. This final act cements Jimmy's role as the true villain of the Tulpar, a man unwilling to face his own demons and responsible for the destruction of his crew. We're fully immersed in the mind of Jimmy. In post-crash, the game primarily unfolds from his perspective, how he perceives the crew's behavior toward him. Before the crash, we saw things through Curly's viewpoint, which offered insight into how others viewed him. In stark contrast, the post-crash crew universally harbors disdain for Jimmy, with one notable exception, Daisuke. Daisuke, likely spared the morbid details of Jimmy's true intentions to crash the ship, remained oblivious to the extent of Jimmy's actions. I suspect Swansea and Anya deliberately withheld their shared dislike of Jimmy from Daisuke to preserve his optimism during the bleak post-crash events. Daisuke's role is often portrayed as comedic relief, whether it's getting stuck in the foam or naively pondering how his heroics might impress the ladies if they're ever rescued. Yet the game gives us a rare glimpse into Daisuke's vulnerabilities, particularly when he drinks too much mouthwash and collapses on the ground. In this moment, we see his take on responsibility. He reveals that his mother forced him into the internship program with the Pony Express, calling him a slacker beforehand. While he expresses hope that his mother won't blame herself for his current predicament, he ultimately takes the blame upon himself. Daisuke acknowledges his aimlessness, his inability to pursue a career or define his ambitions, and calls himself a screw-up. Rather than resenting his mother for putting him aboard the Tulpar, he owns his choices and their consequences, something Jimmy will never do. Both Swansea and Daisuke accept responsibility for their actions, even when their current situation isn't entirely their fault. It's Jimmy's refusal to take responsibility that has doomed them all. Anya, however, is an outlier. There's no real responsibility for her to claim. She does her best to tend to the crew's injuries and conducts their psychological evaluations dutifully, except in Jimmy's case, where her justified uncomfortableness of him prevents her from proceeding. Her role is largely one of survival and coping with the trauma Jimmy inflicted upon her. As we transition into the judgment section, we're shown Jimmy's delusional state of mind. This descent reveals the sharp contrast between the crew's acceptance of responsibility and Jimmy's incessant deflections. The weight of guilt and accountability, which Jimmy avoids at every turn, begins to manifest in surreal and haunting ways, bringing us closer to the reckoning he so desperately tries to evade. Jimmy has fully descended into madness, staging a grotesque mockery of the crew's pre-crash celebration for Captain Curly. He arranges the corpses of his dead crewmates around the table, reflecting the earlier display of admiration for Curly as captain. However, this chilling scene serves to highlight Jimmy's failure as a leader. Instead of appreciation, his actions would have earned him only resentment and hatred from the living. Curly, still alive but completely incapacitated, can only express himself through laughter or tears. During Jimmy's breakdown, he places Curly on the table and grotesquely cuts into him as if he were a celebratory cake, a horrifying twist on the captain's once respected role. Jimmy delivers a rambling, delusional motivational speech to reassure himself, claiming that everything will be fine and that he'll somehow fix the irreparable. His psychosis deepens further as he enters another delusion, a hallway aboard the Tulpar, filled with countless watchful eyes glaring at him from the walls. These eyes likely represent Curly's gaze, silent, unrelenting, and judgmental. Stripped of mobility and speech, Curly's only means of reacting to the horror around him is through his remaining eye, which seems to pierce into Jimmy's every move. Earlier in the game, Jimmy mentions feeling as though everyone is looking at him with criticism, reflecting his deep paranoia and fear of exposure as the coward he truly is. This sequence amplifies the idea that Curly, even in his immobile state, serves as a constant reminder of Jimmy's failures, a witness to the full extent of his breakdown. In this hallucination, the player encounters a disturbing and symbolic puzzle that provides insight into Jimmy's perception of Curly as both a person and a superior. Curly, still gravely injured, is now seated and connected to several valves. The puzzle tasks the player with feeding Curly his own severed leg, an act made possible by manipulating the valves to pass the dismembered limb through Curly's digestive system. This grim mechanic parallels Jimmy's real-life struggle to force Curly to take his medication, an act that was both physically challenging and emotionally unbearable for him. Or perhaps this is Jimmy just feeding Curly his own leg. Jimmy's difficulty with administering the pills could stem from multiple factors. On one level, it could represent his guilt, as he knows he is responsible for Curly's injuries and cannot bear to see his former captain in such a helpless state. On another level, this puzzle might symbolize Jimmy's internalized perception of what it means to be a captain. Puzzles are inherently designed to challenge and frustrate, requiring careful thought to solve. Through this lens, Jimmy may view the role of a captain as a similarly incomprehensible and insurmountable challenge, one that he cannot hope to navigate or succeed in. Unlike Curly, who embodied the qualities of leadership Jimmy so deeply envied but could never replicate. Whether the player finds the puzzle easy or difficult, its inclusion highlights Jimmy's fractured psyche and his ultimate inability to reconcile the burden of responsibility. This sequence, placed within the confines of Jimmy's subconsciousness, drives home the notion that he has always found the concept of leadership baffling and unreachable, a stark contrast to Curly's natural aptitude for the role. But as with much of Mouthwashing, this is open to interpretation and stands as one of the many ways the game captures Jimmy's unraveling mind. Nearby, a TV flickers with the words, "Help me," reflecting Jimmy's crumbling mental state. Staring into the screen, Jimmy imagines a conversation with Curly, seated calmly, engulfed in flames throughout the dialogue. This hallucination captures Jimmy's desperation to escape the guilt of his actions. In this fabricated exchange, the version of Curly in Jimmy's mind offers to take the blame, framing himself as a suicidal pilot who couldn't handle losing his job. Meanwhile, Jimmy is portrayed as an innocent bystander, a victim undeserving of the fallout. This is not Curly speaking, but rather Jimmy's projection, a last-ditch effort to absolve himself by placing responsibility on someone who cannot refute him. Unable to endure the weight of his guilt, Jimmy collapses, muttering apologies and insisting everything was an accident. For the first time, we see him express a shred of remorse. Yet even in the breakdown, Jimmy reduces the crew's suffering to a mistake, avoiding full accountability. His sorrow is not rooted in empathy, but in his ability to reconcile his failures with the judgment he fears. The final delusion confronts Jimmy with the consequences of his assault on Anya and her pregnancy, a topic he evades throughout the game. Earlier, Jimmy insulted and dehumanized Anya, even telling her to unalive herself when she revealed her pregnancy. He refused to acknowledge the gravity of his actions, viewing the situation solely as a threat to himself, evidence of his crimes and the punishment it would bring if discovered. His guilt emerges only when others, like Curly and Swansea, call out his behavior, but even then, Jimmy responds with silence or deflection. In this hallucination, there is no direct depiction of Anya or her child. Instead, the imagery is symbolic. The player encounters a grotesque womb filled with distorted fetus-like forms. Using a sonogram device, the player must locate a malformed fetus resembling a pony, symbolizing the product of Jimmy's violence and the haunting specter of judgment. Once the fetuses are located, a massive centipede-like creature emerges, composed of distorted versions of the Pony Express mascot, Pole. The creature chases Jimmy, embodying the consequences he cannot escape. The monstrous Pole is a culmination of Jimmy's fears, the legal and corporate repercussions of his actions, amplified into an overwhelming, inescapable force. Jimmy isn't afraid of fatherhood or the child itself. He's terrified of what the baby represents, irrefutable evidence of his assault and the accountability he spent the entire game running away from. By dehumanizing Anya, reducing her to an obstacle, Jimmy reveals his true self, a coward who prioritizes his own preservation over the lives he has destroyed. After the delusion subsides, Jimmy walks down a hallway lined with his crew's identification cards, symbolizing his acknowledgement of their deaths as a direct result of his actions. However, Anya's ID is notably absent, reinforcing the idea that Jimmy feels no guilt over her death. To him, Anya was never a person, just another obstacle. Poor Anya. Jimmy's final hallucination centers on the Pony Express mascot, Pole, in a scene rife with potential interpretations. While some speculate that Pole represents Anya speaking through Jimmy's subconsciousness, given the shared blue text used for the dialogue, I see this moment as Jimmy partially admitting to his vile actions. This theory of Anya's voice is intriguing, but I'll be focusing on Jimmy's internal reckoning. The conversation begins with Pole commenting that titles like boss and old man are above Jimmy's pay grade. This sentiment echoes a recurring truth in the game. Jimmy was never fit to be a captain. His actions both before and after the crash demonstrate a lack of capability and morality. His struggles back on Earth are hinted at, and his behavior aboard the Tulpar confirms his unfitness for leadership. From Anya's assault to his ultimate plan of murder-suicide to cover his tracks, Jimmy's inability to handle responsibility is painfully clear. The other characters' views of Jimmy reflect his reality. Anya only praised him out of fear and trauma. Swansea openly called him a coward in his final moments, and Daisuke, too trusting to see Jimmy's true nature, fell victim to his manipulation. As the dialogue continues, Pole forces Jimmy to confront his guilt, particularly toward Captain Curly. Jimmy admits he has done terrible things, but clings to the delusion that he can somehow fix everything, even as the situation spirals beyond repair. For the first time, Jimmy acknowledges that Curly was a better man, a truth he has begrudgingly known, but only now fully admits. This moment marks a step closer to Jimmy's self-judgment, as he edges toward accepting the monstrous reality of his actions. When Pole questions Jimmy's belief, Jimmy responds earnestly, citing the phrase first introduced by Anya, "Our worst moments don't make us monsters." The irony here is stark. Jimmy parrots Anya's words, despite being the cause of her suffering. Pole abruptly cuts him off, asking, if all of that is true, why are you still concerned with him? This sharp retort underscores Jimmy's fractured psyche as he wrestles with guilt, denial, and the desperate desire to escape judgment. The most striking moment of the sequence comes during Pole's final question. If Jimmy truly believes that his worst moments don't define him as a monster, why doesn't he end Curly's suffering with a mercy kill and use the final Chirostasis pod for himself? The answer lies in Jimmy's inability to face the truth. He knows his worst moments do define him as a monster. Keeping Curly alive isn't an act of duty or compassion, but a desperate delusional attempt to rewrite his failures. Jimmy clings to an illusion of responsibility and heroism, believing that sacrificing himself to save Curly will somehow make him the hero he's always envied Curly for being. When Jimmy wakes from his hallucination, the grim reality of his actions is laid bare. He has arranged the corpses of his crew members around a table, with Captain Curly at the center, now missing part of his leg. Realizing what he's done, Jimmy heads to the utility room in a final futile attempt at redemption. However, this act comes far too late, not just for Curly, but for Jimmy himself, whose path to ruin was cemented long before the events of the game. Jimmy makes his way to the utility room, carrying Curly in his arms. At this point, he has accepted he's beyond redemption, a realization brought to light during his earlier conversation with Pole. As he carries Curly, Curly's eyes, much like throughout the game, remain fixed on the player. This recurring motif symbolizes Curly's constant judgment of Jimmy's actions, silently observing and condemning him. After placing Curly in the last functional Chirostasis pod, the game shifts to Curly's perspective. Through the glass of the pod, we see Jimmy delivering his final monologue. This moment is a culmination of the recurring reassurances seen throughout the game, where characters attempt to convince themselves or others that everything will be okay. Jimmy, however, directs his assurance to Curly, promising that he will be fine now that he is in the pod. Yet, this reassurance is hollow. The Chirostasis pod has a maximum functionality of 20 years, and with the Pony Express shutting down, it's doubtful the company would even bother rescuing a lost freighter. The futility of this promise underscores Jimmy's delusion and his desperate attempt to leave behind a semblance of redemption. Jimmy acknowledges his actions, admitting he hurt Curly despite his supposed intent to save him. His words, "You always had my back. I ended up hurting you even though I was trying to save us," emphasize his distorted narrative he clings to, the belief that he was trying to be a hero. But the reality remains clear. Every problem the crew faced stemmed directly from Jimmy's actions. His obsessive fixation on Curly, born out of envy and admiration, warped into something destructive. This obsession fueled his betrayal, yet in his final moments, it also drives his act of salvation. Jimmy's last lines, "We fixed it and I fixed it," encapsulate the profound tragedy of his character. These words, spoken after placing Curly in the final Chirostasis pod, reflect Jimmy's delusional belief that this single act somehow redeems the irreparable harm he caused. It is a final desperate attempt to rewrite his legacy, as though saving Curly absolves him of the destruction and suffering he inflicted. By casting himself as a martyr, Jimmy tries to transform from the villain of the story into its tragic hero. The shift from we to I is especially revealing. The initial we evokes an imagined camaraderie with Curly, a partnership in this supposed redemption. But the solitary eye exposes the deep isolation and self-centered nature of Jimmy's final act. His gesture is not one of genuine remorse, but of desperation, a feeble attempt to craft a narrative where he is remembered as a savior. His delusion is underscored by his ultimate decision to take his own life, pulling the trigger of the ship's firearm in an off-screen act of finality. The method of his death, a gunshot, carries profound symbolic weight. Guns are tools of control and violence, and throughout the game, they represent the very power Jimmy sought to wield, but could never truly master. By using the weapon to end his life, Jimmy symbolically acknowledges the futility of his attempts to control his fate and the fate of others. However, his suicide is not an act of accountability. It is yet another attempt to avoid true reckoning. Rather than face the consequences of his crimes, Jimmy seeks an escape, leaving behind the wreckage of his actions for others to uncover. Jimmy's closing declaration, "I fixed it," is perhaps the most haunting moment of the game. It reveals his tragic misunderstanding of redemption and responsibility. Nothing is fixed. The damage to his crew, Curly and Anya, is permanent. His self-inflicted death does not undo the devastation, but instead solidifies his legacy as a man consumed by cowardice, envy, and delusion. Jimmy's story is a stark reminder of the destructive power of self-deception and the inescapable consequences of running from the truth. Mouthwashing delivers a haunting narrative that lingers long after the final scene. At its core, it's a story about the destructive weight of guilt, the consequences of evasion, and the devastating fallout of unchecked envy and vile actions. Jimmy's journey, while rooted in denial and manipulation, ultimately spirals into a desperate attempt at redemption. A redemption that feels as hollow as it does inevitable. The game masterfully unpacks the theme of responsibility, contrasting characters like Swansea, who confront their flaws with honesty, against Jimmy, who avoids accountability at every turn. His actions, from the crash to the tragic ends of his crewmates, are a testament to how selfishness and avoidance can unravel not only his life, but the lives to those around him. Even in his final moments, Jimmy's delusion of fixing it underscores his inability to fully grasp the gravity of his actions. What makes Mouthwashing particularly impactful is how it refrains from offering simple resolutions. The grim reality is that not every story ends with absolution, and not every character is afforded the chance to atone in a meaningful way. The repeating nature of Jimmy's failures, his manipulation, his violence, his inability to confront himself, is a mirror to the repeating struggles we all face when avoiding the truth. While not as bad as Jimmy, hopefully. As players, we are thrust into Jimmy's crumbling psyche, witnessing firsthand the twisted rationalizations he uses to justify his actions. But the game forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions. What does redemption look like when it's built on the suffering of others? Can someone truly take responsibility if they destroyed everything in their path? No, not in Jimmy's case. Jimmy's final actions, while cloaked in the guise of redemption, only serve to underline the depths of his selfishness and cowardness. Throughout the game, he manipulates, harms, and ultimately destroys those around him, running from responsibility at every turn. Even in his final moments, Jimmy's decision to place Curly in the cryostasis pod isn't driven by genuine remorse, but by a desperate need to rewrite his legacy. His monstrous behavior, from orchestrating the ship's crash to dehumanizing and insulting Anya and exploiting Daisuke, cements his place as the true architect of the Tulpar's tragedy, a captain not of salvation, but of despair. Curly's role in the events aboard the Tulpar is a tragic case of inaction and misplaced priorities. While he is often portrayed as the noble and competent captain, his negligence regarding Jimmy's assault on Anya reveals a devastating flaw in his character. Curly's decision to overlook Jimmy's behavior, not out of malice, but likely due to the overwhelming pressures of his role, sets the stage for the ship's descent into chaos. By failing to act decisively, Curly inadvertently enables Jimmy's destructive spiral, allowing his co-pilot to manipulate, harm, and ultimately destroy the crew. Curly's inability to confront the truth about Jimmy, whether due to fear of retribution from the Pony Express or his own internal conflict, reflects a systemic failure, not just of leadership, but of personal accountability. His silence in the face of Anya's suffering speaks volumes about the toxic environment aboard the Tulpar, where even a well-intentioned captain succumbs to the pressure of corporate roles and interpersonal complications. In the end, Curly's passivity cost him everything: his crew, his health, and his reputation. While Jimmy is undeniably the architect of the Tulpar's tragedy, Curly's failure to protect his team when it mattered most cements his role as a tragic figure, one whose negligence turned a desperate situation into an unmitigated disaster. Mouthwashing doesn't provide answers. Instead, it leaves us with a profound sense of discomfort, a reflection on human fragility, and the realization that some sins leave scars too deep to heal. Through its unflinching portrayal of moral collapse, the game challenges us to confront the ways we justify our own actions and avoid accountability. In the end, Mouthwashing is a cautionary tale for all of us, a reminder that running from guilt doesn't erase it, and that redemption, if it comes at all, must be earned through truth and accountability, not delusion. Wow, if you stayed around till the end, thank you. And I do got a few things to say about this video and myself. So this was a pretty long video, right? And you probably noticed I'm not really good at talking. I did write a full script for this video, and it did take me a while to read it and record my lines. I switched mics like 2 different times, and I found out in sometimes in my recording lines that I was talking too loud or talking too soft. So I had to redo a lot of things, and I'm really inexperienced in this field of making YouTube videos. And this is like the first video I ever spent so long editing it, like just adding little transitions, moving the image from left to right. And I had fun doing it, but I did stay up countless nights just editing away. And I hope the final product is somewhat enjoyable. I really hope you guys enjoyed those little edits I put in this video. And yeah. Now, during the making of this video, I really did refrain from watching other people's video analysis on mouthwashing. And I feel like that was probably the best choice, because there are countless videos on mouthwashing, I know, and I'm not the first person to land on the moon. Anyways, the main point I'm trying to make here is I hope you don't see this video as like a copycat, because I really did enjoy this game. I enjoyed playing it, I enjoyed seeing the characters, I enjoyed seeing this not horrible, but this horrible events happening to these people. The story is great. This game feels like an analysis in the mind of a man-child's mind. Jimmy's. Anyways, before I ramble on too much and I'm really pushing that 10-minute mark, I just want to say thank you for watching, and I do have a few more videos planned in the next few weeks. Maybe I'll read some creepypastas, maybe I'll deep dive into Bigfoot or another video game analysis, particularly Silent Hill. I really want to do a video on that. Anyways, this has been Stalkeen. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all later.